David has a first-class honors degree in mechanical engineering from Cambridge University. He is the current leader of the Reform Party of British Columbia and has appeared on several radio programs, including Coast to Coast AM with George Noory. David Hawkins can be heard every Wednesday on AbelDanger with co-host Field McConnell. You can learn more about David Hawkins and AbelDanger by visiting abeldanger.net, A-B-E-L, danger.net. David, in your opinion, were the Boston bombings a staged false flag attack?
Absolutely, Russell. And we now know, or at least we believe we know, the organization that had the motive and the opportunity and the weapons, and I'm thinking particularly of internet communications, to stage that attack. And interestingly enough, that would be out of Vancouver in British Columbia. Specifically, the Vancouver Film Studios off Boundary Road, which are owned and operated by the McLean Group. And they've been in business for quite a long time. And one of the vehicles that they use in the film industry is an outside broadcast satellite tracking truck. And they provide that through a company called Signal Systems Incorporated, which is a subsidiary of the Vancouver Film Studio Connection. And if you Google CTV satellite truck in Boston, Russell, and look for images, you'll see that one of these trucks ostensibly was sent to Boston to record the finish of the Boston Marathon, but it obviously gives a very good cover story for what is known in the spy trade as a man-in-the-middle attack. And a man-in-the-middle attack is where you have two parties who are communicating to each other with encryption, and the man in the middle gets in between them and takes the messages from party A and adjusts them slightly and passes them on to party B and represents themselves as party A. And if they're successful at that, both party A and party B continue in good faith doing what they're supposed to be doing, like putting on an exercise. In fact, the term used at Boston was, "This is a drill, don't worry." So there are a lot of actors near the finish line talking about a drill to the public at large. There were actors who had previously been injured. For example, in Afghanistan, there was a guy there who lost his leg, and there was just the stump showing and the prosthetic. When you took off the prosthetic, they covered him with tomato juice. And basically, you can see the picture of this guy with a bone sticking out at the end of the stump. And I believe anyone in emergency response will know that an injury of that type in line, you're probably dead within a minute, but through a combination of shock and a loss of blood. If it's a genuine injury, the aortas and the veins will be pumping blood, and it'll be spouting out of the guy's stump. He's actually sitting up looking at it. He's an actor. It's a bone stump with redness around it, right? And the guy is sitting up. But the point is, if that was caused by a bomb, what should be happening, the guy is obviously alive, he's sitting up, blood should be pumping out of the stump. It isn't. But this would be typical of an organization, for example, called Crisis Actors, which goes for exercises and war games and mass casualty events and puts the actors in place and gives them uniforms and coats them with this and that and the other, blood and gore and the rest of it, to test the ability of the first responders to put together a coordinated reaction and save lives, triage, etc., etc. So it's a test. And you dress up to play the part, and there are organizations associated with the movie and television industry that deploy to a scene, such as the war game or continuity of government exercises on 911, or the lone gunman exercise near Sandy Hook. I used to live in Connecticut. I lived at Westport, and I used to visit Bridgeport. When the Sandy Hook mass casualty events were being simulated, there was a lone gunman exercise going on in Bridgeport, which is about a 40-minute drive from Newtown, where the Sandy Hook Elementary School is. So what they do is they send in an outside broadcast unit, and it's called, in the film industry, post-production. So you're getting feed from the crime scene or the exercise scene, and the post-production coordinator can mix and match to maintain credibility. Let's say it's a fictional TV series like Cold Squad, and they are responsible for maintaining the momentum and storing the exercise story. so that subsequently the first responders can be briefed on what they did and didn't do correctly. So you have an extraordinary opportunity, Russell, to execute what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack. If the post-production people are corrupt, what they're doing is they're trying to create news by recording an exercise and then inserting or injecting it into the mainstream media. And if you sit in front of the television or your computer screen, you cannot differentiate between a well-acted exercise and the real thing. And that's what they did in Boston.
The casualties, are these real people? Was there a real bomb?
The point is, we don't know. But let me just stake a claim. I'm an expert in explosives. I probably built 1,000 improvised explosive devices with 10,000 shaped charges in them. I've stored them. I've transported them. I've armed them on offshore rigs, and I'll come to the arming business because there's two stages of arming an explosive device. One is ballistic arming, and the other is electrical arming. I'm an expert in both, and the precautions that you take with this kind of stuff. And then, ultimately, the disposal of improvised explosive devices. Now, let me just challenge your listeners, perhaps yourself there, Russell. If you plan an exercise bombing in Boston as a drill to test the ability of the first responders to respond correctly, you're going to use, if it's just a drill, a smoke bomb or a flash bomb, right, with very little percussive impact on the bodies in the area. So there'll be actors acting the part, but you're not going to kill the actors, right? So you hire someone to carry the backpacks containing the smoke bomb or the flash bomb into the Boston finish area, the marathon, and tell them to put down the satchels and then move away. So what you've got are the classic passes. This is exactly the technique that they used with the London Underground bomb. With the London Underground, you had an exercise where 4 bombs were to go off at certain times, and they were supposed to be flash bombs to test the ability of first responders to respond and check the communication system. And what they did is they substituted real bombs for the flash bombs. So the parties carrying in the backpacks with the flash bombs were genuine actors, and subsequently they were accused of placing the bombs, and there was a manhunt on. So that's what happened in Boston.
The drill goes live, as Webster Tarpley says.
The drill goes live, but let me come back to the business of arming an explosive. When you arm explosives, you have a fuse, you have primer cord, and you have the shaped charge. The shaped charge is the very dangerous, highly penetrating thing that can go through steel and rock in the oil industry, or cut box columns and bring buildings down, etc. Running behind the shaped charge is primer cord that carries the detonation pulse from the fuse. And the fuse has got a couple of wires sticking out of it if it's a wireless triggered device. If it's not, it's just rather like a toy car with a battery. But the fuse sends an initial pulse down the primer cord, and that sends the bomb or explodes the bomb. It's extremely dangerous to get the order of events wrong. If, for example, I was arming a device ballistically, I'm clipping the fuse onto the primer cord. If I then attach the wires to what I believe to be a dead circuit, and there's actually a battery in it, I'm going to kill myself. And in fact, within Schlumberger, we did have someone killed because the engineer forgot to turn off the safety key. So you always arm something electrically, the fuse electrically, before you clip it onto the primer cord. If the fuse goes off, you might lose a hand or you might lose an eye, but you're not going to get blown to pieces, right?
You know, the inventor of dynamite blew himself up, and that's how they discovered it.
Yeah, it's dangerous stuff, right? So now, what we're saying is these two brothers might or might not have put some explosives and killed some hapless or helpless people. But all we know about them, or all we think we know about them, is they placed the backpacks in the vicinity of where the bombs went off, and then went away. So unless they were found with the trigger mechanism for the fuse inside the backpack, they are not responsible for those bombs. Whoever relayed the signal by wireless, and I think we know the technology that they did that, is responsible for the killings in Boston, if they really exist. So we have to go back into the network that sent the wireless signals to whatever it was in the backpack, which might have been a smoke bomb or it might have been a real explosive. And what the people who have got to the crime scene and looked at the photographs is they say this wasn't a cell phone device that triggered the explosion. This was the technology of a local router. Now, If you've seen these children playing with cars, you know, the bumper cars, and they have a little radio device in their hand, that's what was used in Boston. So I believe, and I think we're going to be able to prove it, the truck that CTV deployed down to Boston for its sports networking broadcast contained the local router system from Cisco, which triggered those bombs. So coming back up the food chain, who controls the local router system in the CTV truck at the Boston crime scene? Well, we're back into Vancouver. It's a company called Signal Systems. That's part of the McLean group of companies that owns Vancouver Film Studios. And that's headed up by a guy called Jason McLean. And so currently I'm working on the theory that Jason McLean conspired with Karla Homolka starting in 1996 with the detonation and attacks on the United States government, the false flag attacks.
Let me ask you, let's stay on the Boston bombing thing for a while.
Yes.
The bomb was supposedly a pressure cooker bomb.
Yes.
Was it a pressure cooker bomb, is my question.
Well,
From what
the evidence is there is debris around the crime scene consistent with the explosives inside a pressure cooker. Now, whether there was a pressure cooker bomb, I don't know, because you could argue exactly like outside the Pentagon lawn after 9/11, there was debris consistent with an A-3 Sky Warrior, but not consistent with a Boeing 757. And that evidence was almost immediately picked up and taken away. What these people do that deploy to a crime scene and they want an exercise to go live, they send in a crew consistent with the scripts written for the Cold Squad. Now, you and I discussed earlier this Cold Squad series. It was launched in 1998 and ran through to 2004, and it was aired on CTV. It was a very popular show. And Cold Squad, as its name implies, is they go to a crime scene that's cold, in fact, and they go with a crew of actors and scriptwriters, and they basically start interviewing imaginary characters to see if they can, well, A, sell or provide a compelling story to a TV audience, and perhaps, although it's not obviously that's their intent, to throw light on who actually killed someone. But you can see a Cold Squad is the perfect alibi, Russell. If you can deploy a Cold Squad, a fictional Cold Squad, down to an exercise, and those Cold Squad people have been compromised by some previous crime, maybe out at the pig farm. Remember where the raves attracted people, about 1,700 people used to show up at the pig farm? If you can take those kind of people and deploy them to Boston, you can have actors that are perhaps quite good actors, or, you know, extras. I used to work as an extra in a film, and, you know, you put on the clothes and you jump up and down, you do what you're told to do. And you can't really see where your little bit fits into the bigger scheme of things. I think I did Magic and Ice, or whatever it was, you know, with the Canadian-Russian ice hockey team, and it was a very famous game. So, as an extra or an actor in an exercise, you don't see the big picture. The person who sees the big picture is the post-production coordinator. And the post-production coordinator of Cold Squad, the CTV series, Cold Squad, her name is Deborah Furlong, and she was murdered 4 days before the Boston Marathon Olympics.
The late wife of John Furlong,
who is the former chief executive officer of the Vancouver Olympic Committee, who was targeted in the Olympics, unbeknown to him probably, possibly known to his post-production late wife, Deborah Furlong. They were targeting the Vancouver Olympics for an airborne attack. And the man who was doing the targeting, his name is Russell Williams, and I alerted the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper. In my position as leader of the Reform Party, I was invited to a barbecue that he was attending as the Prime Minister of Canada, and I gave him, and I shared with the crowd with a very loud voice, a sheaf of research that I'd done on McDonnell, Detweiler and Bombardier, and I told him, there's a threat to the Winter Olympics. This was the 8th of August 2009. He stopped dead, he took the material, and he would have known, a lot of people within earshot of me would have heard that I handed him something saying there's a threat to the Winter Olympics. And unbeknown to me, I finessed the attack which I believe he knew about, and prevented it. I can't prove that. He handed the sheaf of information over his shoulder to his security detail, who looked at me up and down very suspiciously. But I'd done what I wanted to do, which is make a loud noise, give him some information, and try and preempt whatever the threat was. And I believed it to be an airborne threat using Bombardier aircraft and McDonnell Detweiler decoy and drone software. 4 days before the Winter Olympics in 2010, I think around the 4th of February, something like that, they arrested some guy. Do you remember who they arrested?
No.
His name is Russell Williams. He's now in jail, got a double life sentence, and he was Canada's premier electronic warfare pilot. And he was in charge of airborne security for the Vancouver Winter Games. And he was arrested because he was charged and ultimately pled guilty to beating 2 women to death. He was a fetishist, so he liked stealing babies, little girls' clothing and put it on. And then he'd set up a tripod camera, and I'll come to that in a minute because I believe those cameras sometimes were operated by a woman, a witness. I'll come to that in a minute. And then he'd proceed to beat a gagged and bound victim to death, filming himself. And this guy was being fast-tracked ultimately to take over the Royal Canadian Air Force. And he was the Air Force Base Commander in Trenton at the time of the killings. He was the Forward Base Commander at Camp Mirage in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates, where I used to live. And that's where Canadian soldiers would fly out to Afghanistan, and if they were coming back in body bags, they'd fly back through Camp Mirage and then back to Canada. This guy was an immensely powerful player in electronic warfare and the kinds of communication systems necessary to do the hit in Boston. And he's a killer. Now, when the Ontario police, provincial police, and presumably the RCMP to whatever extent raided his home, they found child pornography on his military computer. And he said to them, if you expose or continue investigations into the pornography, the child pornography, I will plead not guilty and you'll have to fight me every way through the courts. And unbelievably, they dropped the investigations into the child pornography because I think he was running a pedophile ring in the Canadian Armed Forces. Now, this guy, Russell Williams, was married to a woman by the name of Mary Elizabeth Harriman. And Mary Elizabeth Harriman and Russell Williams were married in June of 1991, which is the same month as Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. And they went to each other's weddings, Russell. Now, let's go back a little further. Back around the 1986 or 7 or 8 or 9, there was a series of rapes at the University of Toronto called the Scarborough Rapes. And allegedly, Paul Bernardo was guilty of those rapes. But unfortunately, for that theory, Paul Bernardo and Russell Williams were drinking buddies at the University of Toronto, and the most plausible explanation is they were raping together. And it would appear that in each case there was a woman filming the rapes. So I'd like to introduce, and this is a word I keep getting tongue twisted around, and it's a very nasty and horrific word. It's a technical term, and the word is hybristophilia. Now, hubris is the Greek word for pride, and hybris, derived somewhat from that, is inflicting an outrage on another party. The philia part means love of. So apparently, and I suppose as we grow up we all have sexual experiences of a different degree, but apparently there are certain people who get the greatest sexual excitement associated with the degree of sexual violence inflicted upon them by their partner. And Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka were those kind of people. And it would appear so was Russell Williams and Mary Elizabeth Harriman. And both Mary Elizabeth Harriman and Karla Homolka were avid home-based movie makers. In that house where the Bernardo Homolka killings took place, they had videos of them inflicting indignities on their captives of the most unbelievable, cruel nature. And those videos were hidden behind a ceiling light in the house and eventually fell into the hands of the defense lawyers that did not reveal them at the trial. And had they revealed them at the trial, they would have shown that whilst Paul Bernardo was evil, the principal instigator was Karla Homolka. Homolka has been released, Russell. Paul Bernardo is still in jail. Now, when she went into the La Joliette jail in Quebec, she went there in 1996. My friend Field McConnell, the Top Gun fighter pilot Marine, who I work with and have been for the past 6 or 7 years on researching these crimes, it turns out that he has a very powerful sister who I believe is a Hybristophiliac. And she's the most powerful bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. When she joined the administration, she started work in the Office of Economic Opportunity. Her first boss was Donald Rumsfeld, her second boss was Dick Cheney, and her third boss was Frank Carlucci, the founder of the Carlyle Group. And she is married nominally to a guy called Eric Marcy, who's a prosecuting lawyer retired in Washington, D.C. But she used to travel the world with a girlfriend by the name of Leonora Guaria. And they'd go to places like Romania. Now, why would a couple of lesbians go to a place like Romania? Well, there's lots of orphanages with little girls in. In 1996, Christine Marcy was given the Gore Hammer Award for, quote, reinventing government. And the person who gave her that award was Janet Reno, who has been accused, and she didn't sue her accuser for libel, of being a lesbian pedophile. This was the Attorney General of the United States of America. In 1996, about 1 month before little JonBenét Ramsey was garroted on Christmas Day of 1996, Janet Reno handed out the Gore Hammer Award to 3 parties for reinventing government in the Department of Justice. Now, you might well ask, or your listeners might well ask, well, who gave them the authority to reinvent government? Well, they didn't. They weren't given the authority, they stole it. We'll come to that a little later. Christine Marcy was given her Gore Hammer Award for sponsoring and launching the Department of Justice, Prisoner and Alien Transportation System, which is a private airline, nominally under government control, that flies the most dangerous people, including pedophiles and killers and assassins and saboteurs and no doubt Hybristophiliacs, in and out of America from places like Canada on false or electronic passports. So Christine Marcy had the power to issue travel documents to any killer and then on a private airline fly them in and out of the country to the pig farm. So in 1996, Christine Marcy, Field McConnell's sister, launches JPATS. His nickname is Con Air, for obvious reasons. The killings start at the pig farm in a place run by a federally registered charity, Piggy's Palace Good Times Society. It was to put on and stage sporting events. You remember that? You started this interview using the word stage, right? Very important. They staged events and entertainment out of the pig farm to raise money to help women get off the streets and off drugs in the downtown east side. Unbelievably cynically, they got them off the streets by taking them out of the pig farm, killing them and eating them at cannibal feasts. When I was campaigning in the provincial elections, one election cycle before the last, I wandered around my riding, which was South Surrey, White Rock, talking to people about the collapse of the justice system in British Columbia, and in particular the pig farm. And we can cover what's happened with the verdict in the pig farm in a second. And I was talking to this woman, and she looked at me very strangely. She said, David, you know, I had a brother, went to a rave at the pig farm, and he said that he would rather commit suicide than appear in court as a witness to what he saw. And I'll tell you what I think, and I can't prove it, but I think I will be able to one day, is I think they were placing bets on the length of time it would take a woman to go through the wood chipper.
This is like the movie Hostel.
Possibly, and that's what they allege Saddam Hussein was doing in his prisons. He was taking people, and he'd take the father or the mother or the child and force the parents to watch someone going through the wood chipper. This is my recent understanding of a word that I'd never heard of hybristophilia. That is, you have these people, and apparently it's predominantly women who may have had some horrific childhood or whatever, been abused by their parents, and they get sexually excited by being beaten up by their partner. And the problem for that is, and it might be reciprocal, right? The man might like to be beaten. And the people who raised Barack Obama in Hawaii, Frank Marshall Davis, was a hybristophiliac. Let's just set that aside for the moment. The problem, Russell, is the danger that one of the parties is actually, in a very calculating way, encouraging the other to beat her up and then threatening to sue them for criminal assault. Well, that would be a pretty quick way of terminating the career of a future Prime Minister of Canada, wouldn't it?
Anybody.
Exactly. Even a cop. Now, out at the pig farm, they had Vancouver Police and they had the RCMP. That same period when I was campaigning, I got on a ferry to go to Victoria to put in my papers as a Reform candidate for this riding, White Rock, South Surrey. And I don't know if it comes through with the way I talk, but I like to talk to everyone that looks the slightest bit interesting. So I was on the ferry, and I was walking around to see if I could see anyone interesting. And I saw a well-dressed man with brightly polished shoes, with a tie, reading a sheaf of documentation, which had quite obviously either the federal government logo or the provincial government logo on it. And I said, excuse me, I'm a candidate I hope to be a candidate for the Reform Party for this provincial election, and I like to talk to people in case any of them are possible voters in my riding. And I always look to see the way people dress, and I noticed that you seem to be reading a government document. May I ask what you are, and if you'd like to talk some more? And he was a very polite guy. He said his name, but this is wonderful. He was the E-Commissioner for the RCMP in Surrey, and his name was, or is, Dick Bent.
Okay.
You couldn't write this stuff, Russell, right? So I said, oh, well, that's interesting because I'm an expert, or I'm trying to become an expert in encryption and the kinds of communication systems that are used by the RCMP to protect communications from being monitored by organized crime groups. And I believe that the RCMP is using Entrust public key infrastructure, which is compromised. And his jaw, I guess he really didn't expect to be on BC ferries and have that kind of technical challenge thrown at him. And he said, yeah, we do use Entrust for private communication, but it's a closed system. And I said, no, it's not. It was actually invented in the United Kingdom, and the root key to your system is not in Canada. It's held by the Ministry of Defense in the United Kingdom. He said, no, that can't be. I said, yes. Every communication that you have within the RCMP and to other police bodies like the Vancouver Police or the Abbotsford Police or the New West Police is being monitored by organized crime groups. And he was actually speechless. You see, being a cop, he's probably not an expert on encryption. He's just told you use this system and it's safe.
That's right.
But it allows people to monitor, and I'm coming back to the pig farm. In 1979, MacDonald, Detweiler and Associates of Richmond, British Columbia, developed a mobile radio system for police forces and emergency responders. And in 1979, they installed a bridge between ECOM, Emergency Communications, the Vancouver Police Department, and the RCMP. And from then on, people in emergency communications, which is at the end of East Pender Street, could monitor emergency calls coming out of the Vancouver catchment area to the RCMP area out of Port Coquitlam. And some people say that the women started to disappear in 1979, reaching a crescendo in 1996 through to 2001. And I believe that that's the case. I believe that MacDonald, Detweil and Associates built a man-in-the-middle technology, attack technology, to sit in between communications between the Vancouver police and the RCMP, such that they could take a prospective victim out of the Vancouver catchment area, move to Port Coquitlam, which is RCMP territory, and send messages to the RCMP if they were alerted that there was some women going missing, and saying, pretending to be the Vancouver police, it's no problem, she's gone back to her reserve up in Port Hardy. So each time there was a warning or a threat or a call from the crime scene that should normally have alerted a proper police force, it would be deflected or intercepted by the people in ECOM. And I believe they've been doing that ever since. And all of the most significant crimes in Vancouver are being orchestrated as man-in-the-middle attacks by the people at ECOM. Now, I went down to ECOM along the end of East Pender Street, just out of curiosity, because I suspected, even though I didn't know this big fancy word, that there was a layer of sexual entrapment and extortion and blackmail going on in BC. I could sense it. No, I don't say I'm a man of the world, but I have been around the block. I've lived in Paris, and I know certain things about people. But when I arrived in British Columbia in 1992 in Vancouver, I believed myself to have arrived in the most corrupt jurisdiction I've ever seen in the world. Not because, for example, in Nigeria, you come to a roadblock and a guy points a gun at you and you pay him money and he lets you through the roadblock and you don't get shot. In British Columbia, it operates, it's primarily white-collar crime through sexual blackmail. That's what was going on at the pig farm.
Well, let me ask you this, because we've all heard rumors in this city. We've heard about the pig farm and what was perhaps going on over there. Snuff films.
Right.
There could have been children there. These videos sell for $25,000 a pop. The rumor that RCMP cops, VPD, were picking up women from the downtown east side,
right,
and taking them out to the pig farm, perhaps selling them, making some extra money. What do you think of that?
Very plausible. The big problem, of course, is they would have a cover story with this federally registered charity where a significant number of police and visitors may well have believed that they were supporting a charity. And embedded in that group of people are another group of people who know that this isn't a charity, it's just a cover story. It's basically a staged killing where anyone present and watching is compromised because the cameras are recording. And if you have a security detail of the, what do they call them, the White Brotherhood, or the 600-pound boar pig and the Hells Angels, and free marijuana and free alcohol and a strip show, there's a lot of testosterone and whatever the female equivalent is flowing. Apparently there are a lot of out-of-town women in leather gear and blue denims, and I think these people were paroled from the prison system in the United States and Canada, and they were attending this as a reward for being good prisoners. You don't get 1,700 people showing up at a rave at a pig farm. Now, in the back of the barn was a film studio operated by Dave Pickton.
The boss.
Well, he's not, no, this is the fascinating thing. He's not the boss. The boss of the federally registered charity was the sister, Linda Pickton. And Linda Pickton was a realtor in Kerrisdale. And apparently she was great friends with Nancy Campbell and Carol Taylor. Nancy Campbell is the wife of the former premier of the province of British Columbia and the mayor of the city of Vancouver and the former chairman of the Vancouver Police Department. Yeah.
I met Gordon Campbell up in Boston Bar one day.
Right.
He was trying to calm down the natives in the area, essentially.
Right.
And I introduced myself and I shook his hand, and I was holding my son on my one shoulder. I had never seen my son act this way. He completely cowered from him.
How old was your boy?
He was 2.5. Maybe.
This is interesting, yeah.
And I could, I'd meet the premier, I obviously wanted to introduce my son to him so I could say that, he shook the hand of Gordon Campbell. He would not look at him. I could not believe the reaction. But to me, Gordon Campbell seemed like the most charming, greatest guy.
My problem with Gordon Campbell is, I have many problems, but going back to the pig farm, in that area, that's agricultural land. It was a pig farm, right? Port Coquitlam was growing. And they wanted to move property out of the agricultural reserve for condo development, and people could make a great deal of money. Right? Both Gordon Campbell and Art Phillips, the husband of Carol Taylor, were the two wives are great friends with Linda Pickton, who had the mortgage on the pig farm, were realtors and developers. So they had an interest in getting the land of the Pickton pig farm out of the agricultural reserve into condo development, and for that they needed the cooperation of the councillors of the city of Port Coquitlam. And they wouldn't give it until they'd been to the pig farm.
So they could be blackmailed.
Well, I'm sure the councillors didn't realize it, right? And they tried to shut this thing down, but there were drunken orgies out at the pig farm with 1,700 people showing up. Through the mortgage from the sister, which was borrowed through a network of Canadian banks, using the pension fund money of the public servants, they built a $1 million, or outfitted that barn as a $1 million nightclub. And apparently the facilities in that nightclub were better than anything in downtown Vancouver. They could seat 500 people at a time. And there was a film studio at the back. And the women would appear. They would be brought from the downtown east side, as you point out, by the Vancouver police and the RCMP. Visitors would fly in from all over North America. You don't get 1,700 people, and the comment was that most of these people who were out there, they seemed to know each other, but they were from out of town. So you're actually, under murder for hire, under Section 1958 of the U.S. Criminal Code, anyone who uses or travels or induces the victim to use or travel in interstate commerce for the purposes of murder for hire, should death result, it's an automatic life sentence or death penalty. So Christine Marcy, the woman I mentioned earlier, she had a private, to all intents and purposes, airline where she could arrange the papers to move people on parole out of jail to Friday night at the pig farm, and they could be back in prison the following day for lunch with a perfect alibi. So that's what these disgusting women have done, and the leaders of Canada and British Columbia, they've created a pool of killers inside the prison system that can be released at will on parole and be put back in jail or killed if they want to silence people. And they go to places, they stage, and again I come back to that word that you used, Russell, they stage the crime using the cover of an exercise or a drill, like Sandy Hook or Boston, so that they have an alibi to place the actors or extras at the crime scene as part of an outside movie group.
It cost the British Columbian government, so that's you and I, over $100 million to convict Robert Pickton.
Yeah, and you know what he was convicted of?
6 murders.
No, he was convicted of second-degree murder, because the jury found he didn't have the pre-planning and premeditation. Now, nowhere in the annals of justice do you get life for second-degree murder.
That's right, he got 25 years.
Yeah, I thought he got 2 consecutive life sentences, but maybe I'm confusing that with Russell Williams, right? But if the jury says they cannot demonstrate, remember the guy's retarded, pre-planning and premeditation, it means they cannot demonstrate or can't prove that it wasn't organized crime.
Yeah, but why does it cost $100 million? He admits on a security video that he killed 49 people.
But let me back up here.
Yeah.
He may have participated in these Hybristophilia orgies and tortures, including children. So I don't know what kind of man he is. He's obviously pretty depraved, but he's not too bright. However, in the greater scheme of things, most people, ordinary people, and particularly if they're in the jail system, they'll kill someone that they discover to be a pedophile. So if you are accused of being a pedophile, and you know that you could go into a prison system, you can be left in a cell with a couple of people who are not pedophiles, who are heterosexuals, and maybe you've got children on the outside. They're going to kill you. And the way you're going to die is not very nice, like blowtorch over your genitals. So even in the criminal community, to be accused, even if you're not convicted of pedophilia, and then sent to jail, it's actually worse than a sentence of death. And if you go to the murder in 2004 in, I think it was North Georgia, in Russia, the old Soviet Union, Beslan was a school rather like Sandy Hook, and it was taken over by 30 so-called terrorists, and they pistol-whipped and raped the children. I think they killed over 200. In front of the teachers, the parents agonized on the outside. And then they did a little background check on these 30 people. They were all on furlough or in the criminal system. So these weren't, high-minded terrorists who want to overthrow a tyranny. They were basically sexual deviants who got pleasure out of the amount of pain they could inflict on their sexual partners. So this is the disease. It comes back to Edgar Hoover's comment, the citizen is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous they cannot believe it exists.
And what is that conspiracy?
That is a conspiracy of Hybristophilia pedophiles. That is a man and a woman, or a man and a man, or a woman and a woman, that engage in euphemistically hard sex with each other, which renders both of them vulnerable to entrapment and blackmail. Because either side can go too far, or be encouraged to go too far, and then accused or charged with criminal assault. Now, if in the background a third party, a child, is introduced into that mix, by one party knowing exactly what they've got in mind, that individual gets complete control over the other party for the rest of their lives. The RCMP in 2000 at a law enforcement conference in Toronto, they introduced this phrase, and it was just before Zaccardelli got fired, I think, by Chrétien. He said, organized crime today operates as a virtual floating matrix, which has penetrated Parliament itself. Now, you can look amongst your friends and contacts. I would invite you to consider the possibility, Russell, there are people who have no reason to tell you what their sexual preferences are, but they enjoy hard sex with their partners. They might be good friends of yours, right? You won't know, and they'll never tell you. But if there's been a child in the loop, they would rather die than reveal what they did. Now, somewhere out there, and I believe I know the database where that is, well, there are two databases where this kind of material has been stored, both starting in the 1996 period. The first one is called the Internet Movie Database. It's an online database of information related to films, television programs, and video games.
Yeah, we all know about it, IMBD. Yeah.
There was another database launched at that time by Christine Marcy, who was Assistant Deputy Attorney General, this is Field's sister, in the United States, and she had launched in 1994 the DOJ Pride organization, which, quote, represents the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgendered interest in the FBI, the Bureau of Prisons, the United States Marshal Services, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms, etc., right? So in 1996, and I'll tell you the company, and I think it might surprise you, a company developed for the Department of Justice what they call the JABS system. And JABS is the Joint Automated Booking System. And that books prisoners and their images and their fingerprints and their background files as they move through arrest, detention, and trial prisons. And I would guess that there's probably now 1 million or over 1 million names on the JABS database, for which Christine Marcy got another Gore Hammer Prize for reinventing government to go with her transportation system. So by 1996, Christine Marcy in the United States had the ability to move prisoners, including pedophiles, in and out of the country through crime scenes, manipulate the evidence at that crime scenes so that they could be staged, and then return the prisoners to jail. And you know the first case that she tested this on? JonBenét Ramsey. In 1996, little JonBenét Ramsey had been told 3 or 4 days before Christmas Day that she'd get a visit from Santa Claus on Christmas Day. She told her little friend, who told the little friend's mother, that JonBenét Ramsey expected to get a visit from Santa Claus on Christmas Day. The mother told JonBenét Ramsey, but no, JonBenét, Father Christmas comes on Christmas Eve. It would appear that JonBenét Ramsey has told that this was to be a secret, and she wasn't to wake her mummy and daddy, and she was to go down to the front door and let Father Christmas in. This was late in the evening on Christmas Day of 1996. Contemporary with that, there's a program called NORAD Santa, where the North American Aerospace Defense Establishment in Cheyenne Mountain puts on a simulation of Santa and his reindeer pulling a sleigh on the radar systems moving through Air Force bases, and they've been doing that since 1947, 2 years after the end of the Second World War, to give the children a treat, because they can look at the daddy's or mummy's radar screens and they can show Santa moving into the United States. And of course you're told as a child you have to be asleep, otherwise Santa's not going to visit. Anyway, this is all part of the excitement, and for 99.99% of the children and the parents it's just a delightful game, right? But going back to 1996, there was a man who would have been able to transfer advanced electronic warfare techniques into that little game, and that man's name is Russell Williams. So my theory is, and we've developed that in several places on AbelDanger.net, is that the NORAD Santa program was compromised, and Russell Williams, who's a pedophile killer, possibly his wife, maybe Carla Homolka let out of jail, and a few others, were flown down in a Bombardier combat support jet to Boulder, Colorado, met up with some local people, went out to the JonBenét Ramsey house, and maybe, I don't know, threw a little stone up against JonBenét's window. She steals downstairs, opens the front door, and they do a Santa on her. They take her down to the basement. There's a ransom note on the steps, and it says, this is from memory, "We represent a small foreign faction." Well, that's interesting, isn't it? The people or person who wrote the note said, "We represent a small foreign faction." Now, either she's creating a total nonsensical story, or they do represent a small foreign faction. Well, what's the closest place that's foreign to the United States? It's Canada. In the text, she says, "We want you to leave $118,000. Give us as ransom to this child that was abducted from her bedroom," right? $118,000 is the bonus paid by the parent company that employed JonBenét Ramsey as the chief executive officer of Access Graphics that year. So whoever wrote the note knew what the bonus was. The parent company was Lockheed Martin, and at the time of that rape and killing, the two directors of Lockheed Martin of interest include Lynn Cheney and Norman Mineta, the transportation secretary on 911. Lynn Cheney in 1981 wrote a book called Sisters, which describes a violent lesbian encounter between two women in the Wild West. She wrote another book about the murder of a vice president. My suggestion is that Lynn Cheney is a hybristophiliac.
Coming back to British Columbia, there are over 10,000 children in British Columbia under the care of Child Protective Services. Because of privacy protection, you can't ask Child Protective Services why, where, anything. Does this tie in at all with the Pickton farm?
Yes, totally. I mean, I ask people, okay, so let's say 60 women were killed out there, probably at least 100 to 120 children. Where are they? But I'll bet you images of those children, not all will have run, the gauntlet of this kind of behavior. I would predict, and I strongly believe, that there is a section of the Internet Movie Database which contains images of these children being tortured and killed, rather like JonBenét Ramsey, whose skull was fractured right around. She was tasered twice, and she was garroted. So there's a level of gratuitous cruelty inflicted on this little girl, which can only be associated with a depraved minority that is bound together forever for fear that those images will ever see the light of day, because it's not so much, I think, the individual's fear being hung or hanged or executed. That would almost be a release. It's the fear that the people that love them, the family and the friends, would, words fail me, but that sort of isolation, the being sent to Coventry, the shunning, is almost, I think, more serious for someone than being physically beaten up, because it would be a tray of everything that they thought they'd stand for. And so another talk show host...
Well, let me add this. The number one fear is fear of public speaking. The number two fear is death. So that underlines exactly what you're saying right there. People have a far greater fear of being ostracized or being publicly humiliated.
Yes, because, you see, I believe many of these children have been abused as children. They're used to a level of pain that you and I could only dream about. I went to a British boarding school. It was a nice school. I got beaten once on the bomb, 6 lashes with a cane because I bullied someone. Actually, it was more rambunctious, and I knocked a door down in the dormitory, and my friend and I, we put the door back, hoping no one would notice, and the matron walked in, and the door fell on her, you see. So we'd sinned and erred in our ways, and it was a perfectly legitimate, but it was very painful. It raised wheels and blood, and, my nurse mother was absolutely infuriated, and she wanted to sue the headmaster, etc., etc. But there are other schools, like the most famous school in the world is probably Eton in the United Kingdom, and that was founded in, 1450. And in the 16th century, they used to have what they call beating Fridays, and they'd take a young boy, and they'd bend him over this wooden block, and he'd be beaten by older boys with his naked bum until his bottom was flayed in and bleeding. Now, in retrospect, and that was the 16th century, what you bred there was children belonging to the most powerful families in the land, right? Eton has produced lots of prime ministers and very wealthy people. David Cameron, the present prime minister, went there, and it's got 400 or 500 years of flagellation, where eventually you would be expected to be able to take that without flinching or crying. And certain people amongst them would be sexually aroused by that. Now, David Cameron went to Eton, and he went to Oxford. He went to Eton with Nat Rothschild and the present Chancellor, George Osborne. Whether they were beaten then, because I don't know if fagging was phased out, they now occupy the most powerful positions in the United Kingdom. George Osborne is the Chancellor, Boris Johnson is the Mayor of London, and David Cameron is the Prime Minister. But David Cameron's great-great-grandfather was the founder of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation in 1865, which has financed the drug trade ever since.
What about Stephen Harper and Barack Obama? Do you think they're schooled in the same manner?
Yes, and their wives are more dangerous than they are.
Well, I think that's certainly true in Obama's case.
Well, look at what's her name, Laureen Harper. From 1989 to 2002, she ran a graphics consulting in Calgary. She and Stephen Harper is a systems integrator, formerly with Imperial Oil. Those two are the most technically sophisticated in this cyber age of any of the world spouses leaders, right? Stephen Harper appears to have hijacked the Federal Reform Party. The founder of the Federal Reform and provincial reform is Ron Gamble, who's a friend of mine and is the president of the Reform Party of British Columbia. He founded the federal reform with Preston Manning. And Stephen Harper was the sidekick of Preston Manning and a backdoor, not very well qualified economist. So somehow during the 1990s, when reform starts to get a few candidates as MPs in Ottawa, there's a movement which looks like reform, and that's the only verb amongst all the other parties, might be a place to go to. And then suddenly Stephen Harper pops up. He runs against Stockwell Day, but his entire campaign was financed by his wife. She's the dominant player. She's a tomboy. She drives I don't know if she drives a Harley Davidson, but she goes camping trips with the RCMP women, and Rosa, what's her name? Rosa, Minister for Western Economic Development. So all the girls together go mountaineering and hiking. Now, does that make them lesbians? Do I care whether they're lesbians? Not in the least. What I do care about is the possibility that you've got a rather naive, backroom, nerdy type of character who's not very worldly. A woman who's a tomboy, wielding a chainsaw when she was a kid, goes to Africa on a pilgrimage to 13 countries during the period when there were massive civil wars and outrages being visited on the civil population, and she moves as a lone white woman across Africa, and she doesn't get raped, assaulted, or killed. And she's a camera person. So my sense is she's got images of people that they would rather die than have revealed, which gives her enormous power. And she selected, effectively, the Governor-General of Canada, David Johnston. David Johnston was the only non-American president of the Harvard Board of Overseers. He was the man that brought Barack Obama to Harvard for his crony-phony law degree. And he's a Canadian. He's now the Governor-General of Canada. A few days after Russell Williams pled guilty to that double murder, the Governor-General of Canada authorized a team from the Trenton Air Force Base to go to the cottage and pick up the uniforms that ordinarily would have the DNA of the victims of Russell Williams on them. And the uniforms were taken back to the base and burned. That is spoliation of evidence, which is a crime. And spoliation of evidence, technically, you're entitled to what is known as an aggressive inference of guilt, because you can't prove that they did it, because they've removed the evidence that you can't prove they didn't. See my drift?
In the 70s, my father was in Tuktoyaktuk, up in the Northwest Territories. Maybe a couple hundred people lived there. Adrienne Clarkson was there for the time he was there. And it was well known amongst everybody that she was a total nymphomaniac. Now, this I would never have normally said on this show, but it's interesting because we're talking about governor generals, people in high positions of power, and, nymphomania in this sense is a deviance.
Well, that's very interesting because back to 1985 or 86, the Governor Generals of Canada have generally been the patrons of an international organization called SOS Children's Villages, which is the biggest children's charity in the world. They're represented in 134 countries.
Unbelievable. These charities, what the fuck? It's just like the Pickton thing. It's
Exactly. But here is the quirk. The people who run these charities, SOS Children's Villages, which was formed in 1947, just after the end of the war, mothers and aunties. There are no men around. There is no male role model. So these women, this is an allegation, are trained to groom children to provide sexual entertainment to the guests. And then they're filmed. And the guests leave, having had their sexual jollies from the children, who become highly skilled in providing satisfaction. Then they're blackmailed. And that particular technique, particularly compounded with violence and the hybristophilia, means there's a significant number, and I would say the majority now of people getting to the highest slots in government are entrapped and extorted and blackmailed. genocidal psychopath who wants the Earth population reduced from 6 billion to 500 million. Apparently got on a plane, a Bombardier VIP jet, probably flown by Russell Williams, and they went on a world tour, visiting primarily the old socialist countries, you know, the Chinas and the Soviet Unions and this sort of thing, because these people are socialists, which have their, as Maggie Thatcher said, socialists eventually run out of other people's money. But this would be the technique. So going back, let's put Carla, 1996, La Joliette. She's a predatory hybristophiliac, probably a pedophile. Bernadine Dawn, the leader of the Weather Underground organization who mentored Barack Obama at Sidley Austin in Chicago. She's the woman who invented the three-finger fork salute for the Black Panthers to commemorate the stabbing of Sharon Tate in the belly when she's pregnant in Las Vegas. These are beyond sick, these people. Bernadine Dawn lectures on terror, torture paradigms and practice at Northwestern University. Let's take Barack Obama. My general theory is it's the woman that you've always got to look at in the shadows. So let's take Michelle Obama. In 1984, she was at Princeton University writing a thesis about the experiences of being black at Princeton, you know, the usual sort of garbage. Because the woman is thick as a bag of hammers, I mean, she preferred to think that it's because she's black that she's not progressing. So she writes this thesis. Hillary Clinton's another one of these clowns. Right? In 1984 at Princeton, her university supervisor was a guy called Henry Beenan, who would go on to become the president of Northwestern University. And there's another very interesting guy who was under Beenan, and that name is David Petraeus, the former director of the CIA, who resigned recently. Now, at these universities, Greek life is alpha, beta, alpha, or whatever, and they're sororities and fraternities that have generally on-campus residences where you can join and you swear an oath of loyalty to these sororities or fraternities, and then they help you progress through the university and ultimately through to a career. Now, there's a problem here. Very frequently with these sororities and fraternities, they have what are known as hazing ceremonies, right, where they beat each other, or such amusing little things as they blindfold you and throw a banana in a toilet bowl and tell you to fish it out and eat it. So all of the major universities in Canada and the United States have Greek life communities, including UBC. And Art Phillips, the late mayor, he's just died, at UBC, was a member of, I don't know, Alpha, Beta, Epsilon. I can remember, but never remember all their names, you see. But you see, at these Greek life communities, young people full of testosterone, particularly the ones that don't easily build a social life. Like I went to Cambridge, I found it very easy to get friends. But if you're neglected and you feel that people don't understand you or appreciate you, you can gravitate towards these kind of clubs where you're bound to an oath of loyalty to them. And of course, if you are beating each other, some of the people who beat each other of the same sex are sexually excited by that. There's now, I believe, 10 to 20 million Greek life alumni in the United States of America, many of them occupying the highest position in the land, including Michelle Obama, who got an honorary Alpha Kappa Alpha or Kappa Alpha Kappa. So there you have your basis for this hybristophiliac racketeering organization, what the RCMP called a virtual floating matrix. What always puzzled me until, relatively recently was, okay, the RCMP says these virtual floating matrices have penetrated Parliament itself, but how do you get them to come out of the woodwork to do a hit and then go back into the woodwork? You can't do it by just power. The only explanation, or money, it has to be fear. So if you want to move a cargo of drugs through the docks or through the border crossing, and you need a CBSA agent, Canadian Border Security agent, to look left as the truck goes through on the right, many of these people are quite principled. Can you buy them with money? I don't think you can buy them with money.
You flash the fraternity sign.
Yes, and behind that fraternity sign are the pictures of the individual at the hazing ceremony, where maybe they've introduced a kid. some of those children that you've just mentioned with social services in BC. Soon after arriving at my son's school, Kenneth Gordon, I went to his friend's home, which was a foster home. There was a man and a woman there, and there were 14 children in foster care in that home. And I walked in there, and there was a physical sense of evil that it just stopped me rigid. Maybe it was a little bit like your son looking at Gordon Campbell. Doesn't prove anything. You see, I can wander around, and kids, they smile at me, and I smile at them, and I joke around, and
I mean, it's obvious. A small child has a different way of seeing the world, and they have to in order to sense danger. So if he senses danger at that age, there's something to it. He doesn't care about Gordon Campbell's politics.
No. So, yes, you asked me about Obama. So Obama, at 8 years old, was in Jakarta, and he was the son of Ann Dunham, who's a communist, and the stepson of Lolo Suetoro, who's a Muslim. And Ann Dunham and Lolo Suetoro left this 8-year-old boy in the care of a cross-dressing, transvestite male prostitute called Turdy. Well, what do you get if you're in the care at 8 years old of a cross-dressing, transvestite male prostitute, whether they're called Turdy or not? At 10 years old, the child is sent back to Hawaii to stay with his grandparents, Madeline and Dunham and Stanley Dunham, right? Their best friends, Madeline and Stanley Dunham, are Frank Marshall Davis and Helen Canfield. Frank Marshall Davis is black, Helen Canfield is white, and they're into S&M. They're pedophiles, and they take films and photographs. So this child was regularly in the care of a black and a white couple who were pedophiles and into cutting and S&M. So I would think by the time he's 18, he's a practiced pedophile entrapment expert who has some really dirty sexual appetites.
Barack Obama.
Yes. Then when he gets to Chicago in, 1991, after passing through the hands of the current Governor General of Canada at Harvard, he apparently joins Man's Country, which is a man's bathhouse. And in Chicago, there are two institutions that were founded contemporary with Toynbee Hall in Whitechapel, where the Jack the Ripper murders took place. One is called Northwestern University Settlement House, and the other is Hull House. And I believe Hull House was used by the Obamas and the Valerie Jarretts of the world for pedophile entrapment. And Field and I believe that we managed to shut down Hull House in January of last year. That's after 123 years in Chicago, where there's a ready supply of young children available for Chicago bankers and luminaries in the education sector and the police to entrap and extort concessions.
Let's go back to where we began, and that's the Boston bombing. And for that matter, any one of these false flag attacks.
Right.
Why?
Okay, well, let me quote to them David Rockefeller, who has a certain gravitas, I think. David Rockefeller said, first of all, in reference to the New World Order, he thanks the Washington Times and the New York Post and other great publications for being discreet about their plans. And he said, quote, the world is now ready to move to a transnational government of world bankers and an intellectual elite. Okay, so that's not David Hawkins, that's David Rockefeller addressing the Trilateral Commission. Okay, so let me just paraphrase that. World bankers, yes. Let's replace the word intellectual elite with a pedophile elite. And you have a much more dangerous combination. Because what they're doing is they're entrapping the world bankers into these kind of situations and then blackmailing them. So the end run is, the objective I believe, is to establish a network or a matrix of sexual deviants bound together by terror that the public at large will see the images of what they've done to children, with access to entrapped and extorted directors of major bankers, so they control global credit. And that's the end game.
That's fine, but how does that help us figure out the Boston bombing's motive?
you probably, in talking to me, you're talking to one of the few people who has the extensive knowledge of electronic and networks and cryptography and bombing. So I can explain. That was a man-in-the-middle attack. They deployed out of Vancouver a CTV sports truck loaded up with the technology for a local area network, a wireless local area network, where they could monitor their actors and their crews in the drill and substitute or arrange for substitution of a whiz-bang smoke bomb to have a real bomb. And they had a very accurate sense of timing, and apparently it was within 9 minutes of the average finish time of the Boston Marathon, which is, I think, 4 hours, 49 minutes, something like that. So if you were a frequent runner in marathons and you were a high-value target, you might have been told, we can take you out any time. And apparently one of the persons who gave evidence right at the beginning was a guy called the Squamish Man. I don't know if you read about that?
No.
Google Squamish Man and Boston Marathon. There was this guy who says, from Squamish, I just crossed the line and the bombs went off. Now, that may be just coincidence, but when I saw the word Squamish, my ears pricked up, and I said, well, I wonder who that guy is. And I don't know a great deal about him because I've been talking about and thinking about other things. But what happens if he was a guy who wanted to blow the whistle on what we've just been discussing today? And they told him, look, to demonstrate that we could take you out at any time, when you cross the line, we're going to explode 2 bombs about 50 meters apart just after you pass through that range. So the objective would have been not to kill this guy, but to frighten him. And they would have been, just like I suggested, they were placing bets on the speed with which a woman's body would go through the wood chipper at the pig farm. I think they were placing bets on the spread. Spread betting in the United States was invented, or at least deployed in anger in Chicago in the 1930s by the former mathematics teacher of JFK. His name was, I think, Charles McNeil. So they were spread betting, I believe, on when the bombs would go off within the spread, and then spot fixing, that is the time between the 2 bombs. They were remotely locally detonated, if you see what I mean. I believe the commands came out of Vancouver. It was transmitted via satellite to that truck. From the truck it was transmitted to a local area router, wireless system with 2 little antennas sticking out of it, into the toy car electronics with a battery inside the backpack, and they'd substituted something that made a much bigger, different kind of reaction to the smoke bomb. So you see, you can create a special effect which has very low percussive damage. So you could have had actors in that area that weren't actually physically hurt by the smoke bomb. That's a special effects technique that developed, and used regularly by people like the folks who run the Vancouver film studios. And then the actors are available to present a compelling image to the public at large. And then they have the fake, the patsies, which are the 2 brothers, which are then hunted down and killed, and they create just enough credibility that they're disgruntled people from Chechnya who've gone to the mosques and they've got all radicalized and so on. I think that's crap. And apparently the guy in the boat wasn't even armed. We covered a lot of ground. When I arrived in 92, in August of 2000, I met John McDonnell, the founder of McDonnell Detweiler, in 1995 because I was thinking of recommending to a defense contractor I'd worked for in the UK to buy McDonnell Detweiler, which is the world's premier satellite signal processing. And this guy, he wouldn't look me in the eyes. He was terrified. I couldn't understand. And McDonnell Detweiler went down to the States, to Dulles, Virginia, where it was bought by a satellite interceptor company. And then it was brought back into BC and started to work on the software for the decoy and drone maneuvers of 911. And a special investor at McDonnell Detweiler at that time was David Johnson, the Governor General of Canada.
Oh, my goodness.
Who was Obama's overseer at Harvard. You see how it goes around and around? So they've got a matrix, you see, and superficially, they'll play you and say, oh, it's the Illuminati, it's the banksters. it's the Jesuits, it's the Aztecan Jews or whatever. All of these, as I say to many of my friends, they're abstract nouns. You can't take them into court.
Yeah, the New World Order. Big fucking deal. What does that mean?
It's a distraction. The people you can take into court, and I keep saying to this people, are the trustees of Piggy's Palace Good Time Society, and they should be taken into court not to prove that they're guilty of a crime, but they're guilty of negligence that resulted in the wrongful death of the women that went out to perform. And I've told that to the lawyers of the families of the people, the victims. You don't go for a losing battle because the jury and the judge, the entire system is infected by terror. They're never going to convict, including the police.
Just to clarify something, the CTV truck on the ground at the Boston Marathon,
yes,
that is not to be confused with this craft truck that has apparently been seen as well.
No, if you Google, under Google Images, CTV satellite truck Boston, right, you'll get a picture of the truck. You can just make out the satellite dish or part of it on the roof.
But what do you make out of this craft truck that also had a foldable satellite dish on the top?
Well, it could be related. I mean, there would be, obviously, the beauty of the marathon is there's lots and lots of sports reporting studios with trucks with satellite dishes. And this is the camouflage and the cover. But it's only the CTV trucks that come back to that reasoning that I've just developed, which is to the Cold Squad. Right? The Cold Squad is a quasi-fictional TV series put out by CTV between 1998 and 2004, which deploys actors and scriptwriters and grippers and film crews to crime scenes which have gone cold. And the question I think I put to you earlier is, and I'd put that generally to the audience, what happens if the Cold Squad arrives before the crime happens? They can dress or stage the crime scene in any way they like to create a full set of clues that has the public chasing off after these poor brothers. But the bomb was detonated by signals relayed through Signal Systems, which is a subsidiary of the McLean Group's Vancouver film studios run by the McLean family.
David, we've covered a lot of stuff, and I think for most people living in the Vancouver area and anywhere else, you're going to find this interview unbelievable.
Well, I hope it's not totally unbelievable.
Well, it's believable. That's the unfortunate part about it. Let's quickly discuss AbelDanger and what you do with Field McConnell.
We had a name change because originally I formed an organization called Hawks Cafe, and that was my email, and cafe was still my email, hawks_cafe@yahoo.com. The cafe stood for Citizens Association of Forensic Economists. So I used to have coffee meetings, and sometimes 20 or 30 people would show up, and we'd take a crime and we'd just brainstorm it, and to the best extent I could, I'd try and help the people they'd leave a little deposit and so on to help me along financially, and I'd try and connect dots for them. But what I'm always saying to people is, you are the best forensic economist you've ever met. Because you go through life in your little niches. You all have some speciality. It might be cooking. Like I pick up cigarette butts at a local place, and now I can go to a place and I can tell quite a lot about the characters of the people who get out of their cars and empty their ashtray on the ground. So to be a forensic economist, you need two senses. One is a sense of smell, because we're talking about corruption. And the other is a good sense of sight to see the little weevils peeking out from under the rocks. None of these people we've talked about, Russell, is smarter than you or me. They've been given a model that's probably hundreds of years old that they've exploited to the max. The big mistake at the crime scene is they leave a signature, like these drills and the actors, and then the timing of the spin that comes out. The crime. So Field McConnell, it turns out, I met him online, and I've met him once. He came out to the memorial service, my late wife. He heard about me through that Coast to Coast show, I think, through a friend, a fellow pilot. And the fellow pilot called me and said, I think I found a guy who can help you, David. So I called Field McConnell. It turns out that he's a Top Gun fighter pilot with the North Dakota Air National Guard. He won 3 legs of the William Tell competition. He's a good Christian. He's a very fast thinker. He's a brilliant man. And he knows a great deal about dogfighting and aerial maneuvers, as in 911. So he told me that his North Dakota Air National Guard colleagues were deployed over the Atlantic through 911. They were flown in the wrong direction. Someone had hacked into their communication system. He told me he had a sister who's a bureaucrat. So I dug into her past, and I discovered incredible woman, controlled the American government. She was the custodian of the United States Department of Justice Asset Forfeiture Fund with Eric Holder, and still is. I.e., billions of dollars have gone through the hands of this woman. She hands it out to corrupt the police and the law enforcement people, like in Boston, and she got to run the jail system with Janet Reno and Jamie Gorelick using this transportation. So she has motive, opportunity, and weapon to deploy killers at a distant venue, like the assassination of Pat Tillman in Afghanistan, or the Sandy Hook thing, and then have the killers either shot on scene, so they don't survive, or brought back into the holding pen in the jail with a perfect alibi. That's what she was doing. This is my allegation with Karla Homolka. Karla Homolka was flying in and out of jail with the collaboration of corrupt guards to get her jollies off killing the kind of people she killed with Paul Bernardo. So AbelDanger, we call AbelDanger, there was a military intelligence program developed by the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Henry Shelton, called AbelDanger, spelled A-B-L-E, danger. And they did data mining, and they identified the cells, the Al-Qaeda cells, being brought into the country by Field Sister. That was aborted in June of 2000, and they ran the disks of the computer into a bath of acid to destroy them. So AbelDanger was shut down, or at least they thought it was shut down, but various people, who shall be nameless, went on to rebuild another AbelDanger called ABELDanger.net. So that's the group I'm part of. Most of these people I will probably never meet. So it's a pro bono group. If you visit the website, you'll see it's huge. There's an incredible amount of material there, all cross-referenced. People are named and identified as associated with this, and we have never, ever been sued for libel. None of our arguments have been rebutted or refuted. I'm an engineer. I used to go and help put out oil fires, and just type it very quickly, Russell, if I, in Paris, have been told by my managers to fly to Brunei to help put out an oil fire, and I said to my managers, well, perhaps it's a conspiracy, I'd have been fired. The Deepwater Horizon rig, they doubled the insurance 3 weeks before it blew. And they shorted BP shares, which went down, I believe, $40 billion in one day. Obama extorted some vast fine out of BP for the damage done along that coast that he can give to his friend.
Largest fine given to a corporation, I believe.
Well, the problem is BP was not the operator of the rig. Transocean, which is a subsidiary of Schlumberger, the company that used to work for me.
Yeah.
That I used to work for. Now, very interesting, the Schlumberger crew sent to the rig to record what is called a cement bond log, which is the quality of the cement from the casing to the formation, to make sure that on completion gas doesn't come up the outside of the casing and cause a blowout at the surface. They were called off the rig 8 hours before recording the log. They left the rig by helicopter, and there is no cement bond log to record whether the bond was good or bad. So BP can't prove it didn't or wasn't negligent. But the job of doing the cement was actually for Transocean. They're the drilling contractor. The kind of people that are deployed by BP out to the rig are geologists. They don't know how to plug wells. So the real party was Transocean, which is partly owned by Schlumberger. And guess who was the director of Schlumberger?
John Deutsch.
Exactly. Also director of
CIA.
Raytheon and a director of Citibank.
Yeah, and Cummins.
Yes. And he was fired by Bill Clinton in 1996 for leaking 16,000 pages of top-secret CIA information to agents unknown. He should be on death row. He's a traitor. And he's a buddy of Chomsky, another one of these Alinskyite clowns, community organizers who basically rub raw the sores of discontent. AbelDanger is an online network of pro bono people who are trying to solve cold cases. We've looked at the JonBenét Ramsey murder. We've looked at the pig farm. We've looked at 9/11. We're looking at the Boston bombing. And we've identified a network of highly skilled technicians operating what is known as a man-in-the-middle attack, and that has a history that goes back to Elizabethan times and Mary Queen of Scots, centered around CTV, the Vancouver Film Studios, and the ability to relay a detonation or an ignition signal, for example, to the Boston bombs. So we're online. We call ourselves a cloud-centric crime scene investigation team. We're pro bono. We're everywhere, and we're nowhere, but we have got probably closer to the truth in these cases than any other organization out there.
Well, I must say, David, that of all the shows that I've done, which is quite a number now, I have never had a guest name names. And for me, that brings us much closer to the truth than I've ever been. How and when did the audience get to hear AbelDanger?
When, soon after we changed our name from Hawk's Cafe to AbelDanger, and I can't put my finger on it exactly, but you see, everything has roots or a DNA. When we built, whoever we are, built AbelDanger, it was built out of the debris of the AbelDanger military intelligence team put together by General Henry Shelton in advance of the attack of 9/11, where through data mining and computer techniques he was tracking the Al-Qaeda cells, and he'd identified them. What he didn't know, and what we didn't know back then, was that the woman who was building the Al-Qaeda database was Field McConnell's sister, Christine Marcy. And Al-Qaeda is the Arabic term for database. And the database is the Arab-American partition of the Small Business Administration, built and commandeered by Christine Marcy in the period 1998 through the 9/11 attack. So Al-Qaeda literally is those companies, those protege companies, pulled out of the database and assembled for the continuity of government exercise on 9/11. And if you Google Amalgam Virgo, June the 1st to the 2nd of 2001, you can see the briefing document for the red team, blue team war game, and on the front of it is a picture of Osama bin Laden. It was a staged rehearsal. They found out when the blue team would stand down, the American, this is Christine Marcy and their cronies, they found out under what circumstances the blue team would stand down at the end of a war game, and that was generally when the on-scene commander, people like Russell Williams in a Bombardier combat support jet, would say 3 minutes short of target, knock it off, which is supposedly the signal to both teams to go and have a drink together and debrief. So the blue team stood down 3 minutes short of target. The red team carried on and switched from decoy mode to drone. Took out the U.S. Navy Command Center.
So how and when do my audience hear AbelDanger?
Well, on Wednesday, if they go to the website, abeldanger.net, they can see the radio show link. And that's 11 o'clock till 2 o'clock Pacific Standard Time using a live stream broadcast.